All right, so in class we've been looking at kind of the culture of the 1920s, and you've read The Great Gatsby, which kind of shows some of that, and then you've also in class we watched The Century, Boom to Bust, about the decade of the 20s, and hopefully you've kind of picked up on the fact that the decade of the 20s brought some dramatic changes to the United States. Um, we have a shift from most people living in rural areas to urban areas, and we have this kind of creation of a new urban scene, and really we have the differences between urban life and rural life developing. Where urban life is kind of this world of competition, this world of constant change. We have more and more cities where we have populations of more than 100,000. It's fast paced. It's one of drinking, gambling, casual dating, those types of things. Very different from the rural life that it emerged from, and that rural life stayed much the same, where people wanted to live kind of simpler. Obviously, rural areas were less diverse. Um, they there's still the close knit of communities, that sense of community, and people were more into hard work and strict morals and those types of things. But again, those values that used to be kind of American values start to lose their hold on the American mind as cities rose to prominence. And again, we've got more and more cities with bigger and bigger populations. Um, and so we see that. But the 20s is also a decade of where we have prohibition. Um, you know, Prohibition officially started with the 18th Amendment in 1920. And that amendment really arose out of a couple of things. We've got various religious groups that thought alcohol was sinful. And so, or cause sin. So, a way to get rid of that is to get rid of alcohol. And a lot of these reformers believe that government should um, protect the public health altogether from alcohol. Um, there's still some hostilities left over from World War One, and eventually prohibitionists are going to win. And again, we're going to have um, the passage of the 18th Amendment. But as you saw in the video, and as you might know from various pop or movies about the era and that kind of thing, although the consumption of alcohol declined, it didn't go away. And we have the development of whole new industries, speakeasies and bootleggers. And from this, we have organized crime that kind of develops. And this is the guys like Al Capone. Al Capone, by the age of 26, had headed a criminal empire in Chicago. And again, it's that kind of mob, those ideas. If you've seen the movie Road to Perdition, it's kind of about that era. Capone himself bootlegged whiskey from Canada. He operated some illegal breweries in Chicago, and he ran a network of 10,000 speakeasies. Um, Capone, though, his end kind of comes quickly. In 1931, he's arrested for tax evasion. He goes to jail. But that's the only crime for which the authorities were ever able to convict him. Um, he's eventually released from jail, but he dies a relatively young man in 1948. But Capone's just one example. I mean, you have entire cities that are kind of controlled by organized crime. And so that's definitely kind of a downside. But it's also, whoops, sorry, an era of science and religion kind of clashing. Um, we've got a battle developing between fundamentalist religious groups and secular thinkers, and that fundamentalists are going to reject the ideas of Charles Darwin, who again is survival of the fittest theory of evolution, and these fundamentalists are going to reject Darwin's ideas and point to the biblical accounts of creation, and will have something known as creationism. Well, we actually have cities that will, or not cities, but states that will outlaw the teaching of evolution. It happened in a city, I believe it's Dayton, Tennessee, I think it's Dayton, Tennessee, where you have a teacher that teaches evolution in class, and he's actually put on trial for it. His name is John T. Scopes. It becomes just kind of this big case. It's known as the Scopes trial or the monkey trials. You have a famous defense lawyer for John Scopes by the name of Clarence Darrow, who's kind of the most famous lawyer of the day. The Tennessee brings in William Jennings Bryan as the prosecutor, somebody we've talked about in the past. Interestingly enough, William Jennings Bryan dies a couple days after the trial ends. But through it all, Darrow's able to get William Jennings Bryan in a little bit of a logical conundrum, and eventually Scopes is found guilty. However, the Tennessee Supreme Court later changes the verdict on a technicality, but the law outlawing the teaching of evolution remained in effect. And so we have these instances kind of going on, and it's just a changing ways of life, and there's kind of a interesting kind of dual life going on as far as, yes, culturally amongst the young people, women, flappers, those types of things are changing big time. Well, at the same time, you have some people holding on to older schools of thought, in terms of teaching evolution in schools. But like we said, we do have that interesting kind of dual thing going on, and one of the biggest areas that we can see changes in the 1920s is the woman of the 1920s, and you have kind of this new term, the flapper. Which, if you wanted to find it like your book, it would be an emancipated young woman who embraced the new fashions and urban attitudes of the day. In general, though, women were becoming more assertive. They were fighting for equal status with men. Some began smoking and drinking in public, and they talked openly about sex. Again, things they would not have done just decades before. Their attitudes towards marriage changed as well. Many middle-class men and women began to view marriage as more of an equal partnership, which again is a different attitude. We're not talking about changing gender roles, though, at this time. Women still agreed with men that mainly their job was to maintain the household and rear the children, but it was more of a partnership there. And so there's that going on. But as always, and you probably have run into this maybe already in your life, there is a little bit of a double standard. Magazines, newspapers, advertisements are going to promote the image of the flapper and young people. Relationships are going to be discussed with a new openness that many older people are going to be uncomfortable with. However, the image of the flapper, or the flapper, is more an image than reality. And so, many young people just didn't quite kind of get into that all the way. However, during the 1920s, morals are going to loosen, but only so far. And again, there's this idea that there's a double standard that develops, which is, this idea that there is in general across the board, different standards for men and women. So it could be in terms of sexual behavior, in terms of being assertive, whatever it might be, and that really starts to emerge and really take off during this time period. Oops, sorry again. If we go to women in general, they do get some new work opportunities. We've got a fast-changing world that's going to produce new roles for women in the workplace. We have these new quote-unquote women's professions like nurses and teachers and those types of things that women really get into. But women, again, are still going to earn less than men across the board. Between 1900 and 1930, the patterns of inequality and discrimination for women in the workplace are going to be established. That really probably we're still fighting somewhat today. But again, we've got more and more women in the workforce. By 1930, we're going to have 10 million women in the workforce. However, of those women in the workforce, again, there's still kind of that glass ceiling. Few are going to rise to managerial jobs. Like I said, women are going to earn less than men. And in general, there are going to be some men that are going to argue that women were just temporary workers whose real job was at home. And again, that really develops kind of that pattern of discrimination in the workplace for women. But the 1920s is also a decade of some widespread social and economic changes, which is going to affect the family life. There's a declining birth rate in the 1920s, something that it hadn't happened in a while. This decline was due in part to wider availability of birth control information. In I believe it's 1916, Margaret Sanger had opened the first birth control clinic in the United States. 1921, the American Birth Control League was founded. At the same time, so you have that going on. At the same time, you have social and technological innovations that are simplifying household labor and family life. This kind of freed women from traditional family responsibilities. I mean, they just took less time. And so women had more time to do other things. And that was something that, again, was different for women. Many middle-class housewives were the main shoppers and money managers. They're going to focus their attention on their homes, husbands, children, and pastimes. But again, their time spent, having to just do household chores all day was less and less. But also with more women in the workforce, you now have women having to learn how to juggle work and family. And that was just, again, dealing with that change. We also kind of have this period of adolescence rebellion. You had more and more teens in the 1920s that are going to socialize with other teens. They're going to spend less time with their families. As peer pressure intensifies, some adolescents are going to, again, rebel from their parents, like maybe some of you have. For example, much of the flappers resisted social controls. This theme of adolescence rebellion can be seen in much of the popular culture of the 1920s, as education and entertainment reflected the conflict between traditional attitudes and more of a modern way of thinking. Speaking of education in kind of popular culture, the 1920s is also a period where education changes in a popular culture, kind of a new popular culture emerges. Schools began to offer a broader range of courses. We now have, more of these new immigrants that schools are going to begin to educate, and taxes are the main source of a school's funding. But the cost to educate a student was on the rise. It was 2.7 billion a year by the mid 1920s to educate the American public. However, we have more and more kids going to school. Enrollments were up, and this led to a widespread increase in the American literacy rate. So more and more Americans um, can go to school and are reading, and that affects um, how people get their information and those types of things. But we also, a period of it, with added literacy, becomes more people reading newspapers. We have newspaper circulation on the rise. We have the also mass circulation of magazines rising. Reader's Digest and Time magazine had 2 million readers each during this decade, so that's quite a bit. But it's also the age of the radio, which was the most powerful communication medium to emerge in the 1920s. And it creates kind of a shared experience where people can hear news as it happened. You're not reading about it a day later, you're hearing it as it happened. And these two things together begin to shape a mass kind of culture in the United States, one that has kind of that's distinctly different from before. Again, it's a culture that has more leisure time, more money, and so people are going to have what they call pastimes. Like maybe you have not heard that baseball is America's pastime. So we have those types of things going on, but we also have kind of these different heroes of the decade. One might be Lindbergh, and I know Charles Lindbergh was talked about in the Century video that we watched. He had the first nonstop solo flight across the Atlantic in his plane, the Spirit of St. Louis. He paves the way for others, but it kind of captured the imagination of the people of the era. We also have movies emerging, both those with sound and without. Movies and going to movies become a national pastime. We've got the famous movies, The Jazz Singer and Steamboat Willie. But we also have playwrights and composers, and George Gerwin and Georgia O'Keeffe. We've got writers of the 1920s emerging: Sinclair Lewis, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Edna St. Vincent Millay, Ernest Hemingway, that are all kind of, again, shaping this new American culture that had emerged during the 1920s. But it's not limited to these white individuals. We have a cultural awakening, so to speak, of African Americans. We have with the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance can be, you could devote probably a class to the writers and things that emerged from the Harlem Renaissance. But it's a different view, and it really was a kind of black is beautiful, and it really arose out of you have many African Americans moving north during the Great Migration between 1910 and 1920, and a lot of them, it caused tensions in these cities where services were already kind of hard to come by, and you're bringing in a larger population, and they ended up living typically together, and one area was Harlem, New York. But as African Americans kind of adjust to this new era, they kind of readjust their goals. The NAACP under James Weldon Johnson is going to begin to fight for civil rights. He proposed the anti-lynching legislation. However, African Americans are going to begin to become a little bit more militant. We'll put it that way. To be a little bit more active in saying this is what we want. Marcus Garvey founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association in 1914, Um, and again, he's going to believe African Americans should form their own society, and his message is of Black pride. He encouraged his followers to return to Africa and help overthrow white colonial oppressors there and build a mighty nation in Africa. So Garvey's got a little bit more kind of liberal ideas. He is eventually, his movement kind of um, loses its momentum when he's convicted of mail fraud and jailed. Um, but there is a legacy there, where again he's appealing to African Americans and their in kind of this sense of we've been held down for so long. It strikes a chord with many African Americans, as well as blacks in the Caribbean and Africa. And he leaves behind this legacy of newly awakened Black pride, economic independence, and reverence for Africa, something that had kind of maybe not been there before. Um, and so through kind of all this, we have the emergence of the Harlem Renaissance. Um, Harlem is a neighborhood in New York, and it's the world's largest Black urban community. And the Harlem Renaissance is simply a literary and artistic movement celebrating African American culture. There are several African American writers that are associated with it. There's Claude McKay, who was a novelist, poet, and Jamaican immigrant. He has some in his poetry. He has some verses that urge African Americans to resist prejudice and discrimination. His poems also express the pain of life in Black ghettos and the strain of being Black in a world dominated by whites. So there's Langston Hughes, who was probably the movement's best known poet. A lot of his poems describe the difficult lives of working class African Americans. Um, some of his poems were put to jazz and blues, um, and those types of things. And then we also have, um, uh, sorry, I'm blanking on the name. It's right in front of me. Zora Neale Houston, who is going to portray the lives of poor, unschooled Southern blacks in in a lot of her works. Much of her work celebrated what she called the common person's art form, or the simple folk ways and values of people who had survived slavery through their ingenuity and strength. We've got other performers. We've got Paul Robinson, who was Robeson, sorry. He was actually the son of a one-time slave. He became a major actor. Um, his performance in Shakespeare's Othello is going to win him some acclaim. Um, but he is going to struggle with some racism he experienced in the United States. Um, and he ultimately has some, I don't know, he brings some indignities on himself when he supports the Soviet Union and communism. And he eventually moves to England for a time and actually to the Soviet Union for a time. We also have Roland Hayes, who was another kind of famous performer. He kind of rises to stardom as a concert singer and that's really what he's known for. We also have the kind of the jazz movement. Jazz was born in the early 20th century in New Orleans, where musicians blended instrumental ragtime and vocal blues into an exuberant kind of new sound. Um, we've got some really famous jazz musicians from the area. One would be Louis Armstrong. Um, he is famous for just his work in general. Um, there's also Edward Kennedy. Duke Ellington was a jazz pianist and composer. And then Bessie Smith, who was a female blues singer. Um, there's lots of different things kind of creating this kind of new culture, black and proud. those types of things.